Amin, Amin, Ya Rabbal Alamin. May Allah is our edge and day. Finally, we will avert the time to the next session, which will be handled by Mr. Hari Widyantoro, PhD, student of McGill University, Canada. I am Winda Adsa. I would like to thank you very much for joining this conference, and please have enjoyed the session until the end of the presentation and the discussion from our invited speakers. To the moderator, Mr. Hari Widyantoro, please welcome to your session. Keep productive and stay healthy. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I offer the session to Mr. Hari Widyantoro. Please take your time.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
First of all, I'd like to thank very much to everybody is coming today, and thank you very much. Special thanks to Pak Bambang Iswanto as the Dean of the Faculty of Syariah, and also all of the faculty member whom I cannot mention one by one. Thank you very. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to have a discussion here. In fact, it is a great honor for me as a lecturer of the Faculty of Syariah, who is now currently studying at McGill University. Well, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our theme today, which is law, politics, and millennial society in the contemporary Muslim world. I believe this is a big theme, which relies on the very broad topics. But as I have read the three speakers' presentation, generally their presentation talks much about how Muslim society, how we as Muslims in Muslim countries face the force of modernity, and to break down how different Muslim communities in different countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, face the force of modernity, whose element is capitalism, liberalism, pluralism, diversity, etc., etc. So, without further ado, before coming to each presentation, I would like to introduce briefly the three speakers. The first speakers would be Imat Balkis, who's also currently studying at doing PhD at McGill University in School of Religious Studies, working with Professor Salvatore, who's also my supervisor. And also the second speaker is Nik Aziyah binti Nik Azman, who's currently tutor at the Center of Al-Quran and As-Sunnah Studies at the Faculty of Contemporary Islamic Studies. And the last is Professor Muzayin Ahyar, who's also a lecturer at the Faculty of Syariah, who inshallah will be going to Netherlands or maybe America. He's preparing his PhD maybe next year or maybe 2 years later, we don't know, but he's been preparing for this, and I believe he'll be studying overseas, doing his PhD as soon as possible. So without further ado, but before that, I would like to briefly introduce him, reading his CV biography. So Imat Balkis is a Palestinian born to refugees parents in Lebanon, and he got his BA in computer science in the University of Jordan, and then also he got his his MA in religious studies McGill University in 2018. His thesis discusses the discourse of religious freedom as a universal human right, where he analyzed the scholarly effort of Western and Muslim thinkers in attempting to ground the modern concept of human right and particularly freedom of religion in the Christian and Islamic thought respectively. And then now currently he's doing his PhD at McGill University with the research interest in the religion and modern society, which includes sociology of Islam, religion in the public sphere, which I think we'll be talking more in later on. Iman's presentation is about the encounter of Islam and modernity. This is also a big issue. We've talked before at the beginning of the meeting about the impact of colonialization in the Middle East, especially in Aljazair. Um, so this is part of the encounter of Islam and modernity. And in his presentation, he tries to track the contemporary Muslim works on Islam and modernity to break down the this theme. He tries to answer how then Muslims should deal with the force of modernity. Um, have we been successfully in facing modernity today? So without talking much more, I would like to invite our brother Imad Balkis to present his presentation.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Brother Harry, and thank you all, particularly Harry, who offered me this chance to meet all of you and be able to speak before you. Thank you very much. Let me put the presentation. I guess I need to share it. Let me see how is that gonna work. Share, host disabled, participant screen sharing, it says. Harry, I cannot share these slides, but I can read the paper.
Ibu Mai would like to help Imad to share his presentation. So while waiting for this share screen feature, would you like to talk about the generally what would you like to present?
Okay, I mean I can start with my presentation until I have a PowerPoint presentation to go along with my written work, so I can start right away. Basically, me do the introduction. Okay, I can share now. Very good. So I'll share this. Do you see my presentation now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Is it sitting properly on the screen, or is it shared properly? I'm not sure how it appears. Do you see it?
This is, yeah. You can...
Okay. Okay. So my speech today will be about the encounter between Islam and modernity in very generic terms, because each of those two elements, Islam and modernity, is not straightforward to understand. Each of them needs elaboration. Islam has been conceptualized by many different ways, depending on as an object of analysis, depending on where do you want to go with your analysis, you start with a certain conceptualization. Modernity is the same thing. There are levels of understanding and explaining modernity, but I'm not going to go into defining each term right away, but hope that during the discussion it will become clear from what angle I'm looking at each of those two elements. So in introduction, I would, let me see, let me having. You still can see my presentation, right? So in the confrontation between European modernity in particular and Islam, the confrontation was presented from the beginning as a rather problematic affair. One can say that a discourse of cultural confrontation and political conflict dominated the representation of Muslim and European relations in the modern period. The encounter took place in the context of military campaigns and colonial invasions and was facilitated through the work of missionaries and Orientalist scholars. In the Arab world, since the mid-18th century and until the early 20th century, Europe was an adversary with military presence in Egypt, Algeria, and Tunisia. The Palestinian scholar Edward Said objects to the term post-colonial and argues that Western colonial incursion continues today, most notably in the confrontation between Palestinian and Jewish nationalisms.
Sorry, Imad, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I cannot see your presentation slide. There's something blocking.
Okay.
Something
that
is
better?
blocking it. All right, great, yeah.
Now you can see it?
Yes,
Okay, very
go
good.
on.
Okay. So for over 2 centuries, this encounter has elicited diverse historical responses and presented constant challenge to Muslim intellectuals. The spectrum of responses extends quite widely from those informed by the centrality of the Quran alone and arguing for a rethinking of the traditions of Hadith and Sunnah, to those on the other side who insist on an understanding of the Quran rooted in the historical experience of the early Muslim community. Scholars advocating modernist approach are often accused of following blindly in the tracks of Western secularism, which relegates religion and religious belief to a private domain and denies a role for divinity in the organization of social life. In exploring the history of Islamic reform from the early 20th century onward, which is my area of research, one finds that common to almost every Islamic reform project is a realization that its success or failure in theorizing an Islamic future greatly depends on its success or failure in reading the Islamic past. And my current research explores active reform-oriented projects at the current moment of the 21st century and will discuss some of the contemporary scholars and how they manage the tension between Islamic thought and modernity in their reflection. The first scholar in this treatment is Professor Fazlur Rahman. He was one example of a modern reformer whose ideas were met with rejection from the traditional ulama. He was preoccupied with the dialogical relation between divine revelation and history. He advocated a methodology that sought to find a balance between text and context, and he tried to resolve this problematic by positing what he called a double movement theory. The double movement theory, the purpose of the first movement from the present to the Quranic times, is to understand the import of meaning of a given statement. To understand it in terms of the society, religion, custom, and institutions of Arabia at the time. In the second movement, back to the present, Rahman seeks to redeploy the value and principle obtained from the revealed sources into the social context of contemporary Muslim society. This, he admitted, requires a very sophisticated analysis, and here lies the weakness of this methodology, because Fazlur Rahman did not elaborate on how such social and intellectual analysis will take place. Rahman also was preoccupied with the role of religion in running a modern Islamic state, and believed that, quote, the most serious question for the future of Islam itself is the ideological problem of the relationship between state and religion, unquote. He discusses three types of Islamic reformers: revivalist, modernist, and secularist, and he dismisses he sums up the dilemma of the secularist Muslim reformer as having to prove the impossible, namely that the Prophet ﷺ, when he acted as a lawgiver or a political leader, he acted extra religiously and secularly. That, unquote. That's what Fazlur Rahman saw as impossible for the secularist reformer to suggest. The conflicting relation between an Islamic and a modern conception of government is shared by other Muslim scholars, like Abdullah al-Na'im, the Sudanese reformist scholar, commenting on Rahman's assessment, argues that secularization of the Muslim public life would deprive Muslims of extremely valuable cultural resources needed for the development of their self-identity. And Khalid Abu al-Fadl, the professor of law at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he teaches international human rights and Islamic jurisprudence, notes that Sharia can help anchor and root contemporary Muslims and serve as a catalyst for hope and moral progress. However, he warns that a lot depends on the meaning or kind of Sharia that is understood and pursued by contemporary Muslims. Rahman's skeptical view is echoed by another prominent Islamic scholar, namely Wa'il Hallaq. Wa'il Hallaq was for many years a professor of Islamic law at McGill University before moving to Columbia University in New York. In his book, The Impossible State, he scrutinizes the philosophical foundations of the Western state, of the modern state system, by examining its underlying moral and political assumptions. Although emerging from a different analysis, he appears to amplify Rahman's doubts. Hallaq argues that, quote, at the hands of colonialist Europe, the socio-economic and political system regulated by the Sharia was structurally dismantled. And he concludes that in today's modernity, an Islamic state is both an impossibility and a contradiction in terms. He argues that the Islamic philosophy of governance, emanating from the Quran and encapsulated in Sharia, is an essentially moral enterprise, and as such is ontologically incompatible with the model of the modern state, which was born from the paradigm of modernity and exemplifies its ideals, which is essentially amoral, according to Hallaq. Now, and as improbable as it seemed to Rahman and An-Na'im and Hallaq, a successful synthesis of modernity and Islamic thought is quite feasible in the thought of another Islamic thinker who is Muhammad Shahrur. In his theorization of an Islamic future, Shahrur, who passed away in December 2019, he had been advocating his views on Islamic reform for over 40 years. He contributes a very different discourse which addresses the major concerns articulated by Islamic scholars, such as the ones just discussed. He too faced a backlash from the traditional ulama establishment and received all kinds of accusations and attacks. He nevertheless appealed to a wide base of Muslim, particularly young Muslims, disaffected by the current state of Islamic affairs, social, political, economic, and spiritual, as exemplified particularly by the traditional establishment in the Arab world. Shahrur stretches the boundaries of the debate and introduces into the conversation a conceptual framework which potentially capable of addressing a range of issues that have lingered in suspension for centuries. He engages his hermeneutical approach called contemporary reading of the Quran, al-Qira'ah al-Mu'asira, to carry out a deep revision of major constituents of the tradition, which leads him to reject abrogation, nasakh, and synonymy, al-Taraduf. These two are indispensable tools of the traditional Muslim scholarship since the 2nd Hijri century. But Muhammad Shahrur, in his approach, chooses to reject them. The contemporary reading approach examines the conceptual and historical underpinning of the Sunnah and Hadith, of the concept of obedience to the Prophet, Ta'at al-Rasul, and what it means, and the traditional understanding of punishment, hudud. Shahrur stands against the traditionally accepted conflation of common concepts such as Al-Quran and Al-Kitab. He distinguishes between those two, or concepts of prophethood and messengerhood like An-Nubuwah wa Risala. Again, Shahrur argues that we tend to conflate those two. They are very different concepts, and so on. The outcome is a theoretical framework that he employs in advocating for a historical contextualization of the traditions of Hadith and Sunnah and reconsider their position of sovereignty within the Islamic legal theory while recognizing them and their importance as streams of cultural influence. He uses his method to mount a deep critique of the grounding principles of Islamic jurisprudence and proposes a comprehensive alternative to the legal theory of usul al-fiqh as the default legal theory since the 3rd Islamic century, which he regards as incapable of fulfilling the universal potential of Islam and of enabling it to assume a leadership role in the modern world. Shahrur draws support in his approach from a larger growing body of reformers known generically as the Quranists, al-Quraniyin, who reject the precedence of the Prophet's Sunnah over the Quran and insist that the book alone should be the central reference for Muslims in organizing their religious, social, and spiritual lives. Shahrur holds the book, Al-Kitab, to be the authoritative source of morals and laws for Muslim communities and accepts the divinity of its source, its revelation to the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, and subsequent compilation. Shahrur does not include the book, Al-Kitab, in the historically evolved body of the Muslim tradition, and accordingly and he contrasts this to the Islamic legal theory of usul al-fiqh and its product, which is Sharia, which he points out are historically developed by generations of scholars over time. His hermeneutic, anchored in Al-Kitab, gives him a protective advantage over other scholars who were attacked and discredited by traditional conservative establishment because they grounded their methods in Western hermeneutics, as was the case, for example, with Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid in Egypt. Am I managing to change you see the changed slide? So the perspective of Islamic thinkers diverge widely with respect to the impact of modernity on the Islamic law and on Sharia. Hallaq, for example, argues that at the hands of the colonialist Europe, the socio-economic and political system regulated by the Sharia was structurally dismantled, which is to say that the Sharia was eviscerated. He explains that the moral question that haunt modernity today echo the same debates of Muslim scholars between the 8th and the 10th century. Those debates extended to the autonomy of morality and the role of reason in determining human action, and were finally settled in a synthesis that reflected a middle position between what he calls the Muslim Kantians, who exaggerated the role of reason, and the literalists who marginalized it. Sharia, Hallaq affirms, was a product of the middle community, al-Ummah al-Wasat, and came out of the elaborate and complex legal system of Usul al-Fiqh. Sharia was anchored in the Quranic message, which taught that humans do not own the earth, that they were created in communities, and that this carries with it the obligation on their part to perform good deeds. Hallaq is critical of the trust that many Muslim scholars place in the modern state. He points out that the state in Muslim countries has not done much to rehabilitate any acceptable form of genuine Sharia governance. He concludes that attempts to restore Sharia on the platform of the modern Muslim state cannot be taken seriously. In contrast to such a view, Armando Salvatore, who is the interface professor at McGill University, in his project, The Sociology of Islam, advances a different perspective on the possibility of a creative synthesis coming out of the encounter between Islam and modernity. While acknowledging that the dynamic of modern state building exerts tremendous stress on the traditions, on any tradition, one must consider that traditions are not only capable of change, but they can only be preserved if they develop a capacity to contribute to govern the community. He proposes that the outcome of the confrontation of Islamic tradition with modernity is multi-layered, and beneath the ostensible threats are hosted enablers of renewal and revitalization of the tradition. Shahrur does not share Hallaq's lack of faith in the future of the modern state and sees it as a viable platform for Islamic engagement. He endorses modern notions of civil society and public sphere as instruments that can counter the grip of outdated traditions on the minds of the Muslim public. Shahrur often resorts to the notion of civil society, to which he ascribes the Islamic task of enjoining good and prohibiting evil, that is, al-amr bil-ma'ruf wal-nahy al-munkar. He reaffirms that ma'ruf and munkar, he redefines them, reconceptualizes them in terms of the normative custom and culture of a given society, and emphasizes the literal meaning of the term ma'ruf, which is known familiar, normative, and munkar being unknown, unfamiliar, contentious. This is a relativistic spatial and temporal conception that changes from one society to another, he argues, and is not governed by considerations of halal and haram, which are the subject and authority of the ulama. Therefore, enjoining ma'ruf and prohibiting munkar is not the responsibility of religious authority according to Shahrur or the state, but of civil society. The press, the political opposition, these are the elements who keep the state in check and monitor its propensity to administrative and moral corruption. While Salvatore views the notion of civil society as an essentially European construct serving the pursuit of modernity, and as such not suitable for non-Western societies, he focuses on the emergence of distinctive forms of civility in Muslim society. He points out to a high degree of similarity between the Western prototype of public sphere and Muslim versions thereof that emerged in the colonial and post-colonial Muslim world. He draws one example from the Egyptian experience of the last quarter of the 19th century, influenced by Muhammad Ali and his successor, in the period Sharia was undergoing a process of metamorphosis, resulting in its emergence in a new conception that attempted to reconcile the body of traditional legal knowledge, which is fiqh and fatwa, with the centralized legislating power of the modern state in Egypt. Other examples include the institutions of waqf, the examples that Salvatore offers. Waqf, which contributed to the public space that was run independently from the central authority. The Sufis and their brotherhood orders, their use of the Waqf institution, and their extended network served as a metaphor for negotiated civility in the space between knowledge production and power of the rulers. In this sense, Shahrur's reconceptualization of Ma'ruf and Munkar appears to resonate to some degree with Salvatore's argument for the viability of a future reconciliation of Islam and modernity via the development of distinctively Islamic forms of civility. Halak sees the way out over a path predicated on giving up the idea of universalism as tailored on the Western model of modernity. He advocates distancing ourselves from the Kantian ethic altogether, the ethic of autonomous reason, and moving towards autonomy of morality, which he understands as an autonomous, irreducible domain of value into which we cannot reason ourselves from outside, but which we must simply acknowledge. While Halak remains unclear on the mechanisms of how to realize this, Shahrur seems to believe that the modern state can be reconfigured as a moral Islamic project, and Salvatore offers a spectrum of concepts and tools to inform that process. And finally, in conclusion, I hope to have demonstrated how the contemporary discourse on Islamic reform is a complex and evolving response to equally new and unsettling developments in the wider context of modernity. The discussion analyzed debates and observed how such debates appeal to Islam through different perspectives, theological, sociological, philosophical, etc., in order to formulate a modernized conception of the tradition and how the meaning of Islam and its categories changes in the process. I regard all these convergences and divergences as additional opportunities for more future research. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Imad Balkis, for your presentation, which is very interesting. Um, yeah,
Wait,
probably.
did I clear the screen now? Is it clear?
Yes, yes, it's clear. So yeah, probably the piece on Salvatore is also pretty interesting and also a little bit controversial, and also very ambitious. It's his ambitious research. He's been questioning years about how tradition should engage in the public sphere. How should tradition engage with modernity in the public sphere? Tradition has not to be privatized in the sense religion should not always be privatized. Religion should not always kept in the private sphere, but it also can go to the public and engage with modernity. Okay, moving on to the. Should we move on to the next speaker before having questions later on? Okay. Now let's move on to the next speaker, which is Nick Azia binti Nick Azman. Thank you very much, Ustazah, for being with us today to present. Before letting her to present her presentation, I would like to briefly introduce her. Um, Nick Azia binti Nick Azman graduated from the Yarmouk University of Jordan in 2006, and also she graduated from the University Islam Antarabangsa Malaysia in 2014. Um, and now she's currently being a tutor at the Center of Al-Quran and As-Sunnah Studies at the Faculty of Contemporary Islamic Studies. Her topic is Raja Parlembangan dalam Demokrasi Berparlemen di Malaysia. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Ustazah Nick Azia binti Mig Azman to present her presentation.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته bisa dengar ya. Jelas ya. Okay, thank you Harry and our honorable speaker Brother Iain and also Professor Muzayin Ahyar. Thank you for Fakulty of Syariah Iain Samarinda for this invitation. Inshallah, this morning I want to share to you all about overview political at Malaysia. But I just prepare my slide and my speech in Malay. Sorry for brother Imad.
No problem.
Okay, inshallah. Inshallah boleh mula ya. Boleh tolong share my slide. Saya minta maaf banyak kerana pagi ni area sini masalah pada connection internet. Connection akan hear your present Brother Imad. Kat sana clear ke tak saya punya speech? Harapnya okey lah ya. Betul? Dr. Maisara, okey. Okey, Alhamdulillah. Tak terputus ya? Tak ada yang terputus? Okey. area sini lain masalah pagi ni. Kerana sekarang mungkin hujan, tapi apa pagi ni tak hujan, tapi masalah apa mungkin itulah kan, mungkin apa musim lah kot ya. Share apa kemudian setelah dan juga kehakiman. Di bawahlah bagaimana demokrasi melalui parlimen. Okay, ada dua dewan rakyat dan juga dewan negara. Dan di sudut pentadbirannya pula terdapat Perdana Menteri, Jabatan Menteri, ada kementerian-kementerian, ada jabatan-jabatan, kemudian di bawah kehakiman mahkamah, ada mahkamah untuk persekutuan ataupun mahkamah negeri. Kita fokus pada raja perlembagaan. Raja itu merupakan tonggak pemerintah, melambang kepada kedaulatan negara daripada daerah Sultan Melaka belum merdeka lagi. Kemudian apa? Sekarang ini menekan dengan sistem raja bermaju dan dia bermula daripada lepas merdeka tahun 1924 merdeka satu perintah beraja yang mengikut peruntukan dalam kelembagaan Malaysia. Okey, yang mana yang di-Pertuan Agong tindak berdasarkan perlembagaan dan juga nasihat Perdana Menteri. Okey, harapnya dia tak boleh nak bertindak itu atas bicara lah. Dan Agong ini Agong pilih daripada kalangan 9 Raja Melayu secara bergilir-gilir dalam tempoh 5 tahun. 5 tahun sekali dia berlaku rotation untuk mengikut negeri. Negeri mana yang diperintah negeri mana rotation itu selepas 5 tahun akan bergilir-gilir dan dia akan menjadi Agong. Pemilihan yang diperlukan Agong untuk peruntukan dalam kelembagaan Malaysia baginda tonggak kerajaan Malaysia lah, ketua utama negara dan merupakan ketua tertinggi angkatan. Ya? Apa ya? Betul? Ya? Tak jelas. Boleh lanjut Okey. Boleh dipaham ya bahasanya? Bahasanya bisa dipaham? Okey, insya-Allah. Okey. Okey. Pemilihan berdasarkan dalam lembaga Malaysia lah. Pemilihan raja. Okey, boleh tengok slide seterusnya. Kalau nampak gambar yang senaraian di Pertuan Agong secara bergilir. Yang pertama daripada tahun 57 sampai 60. Kemudian daripada 60. Kemudian daripada 60 hingga 65. Itu kemungkinan yang pendek itu kemungkinan pada unit mangkat kemudian bukan yang baru. Kalau tak mangkat, maksudnya dia berakhir setelah 5 tahun pemerintahannya. Dia bentuk giliran. Kemudian Perlis, Terengganu, Kedah, Kelantan, Pahang, Johor, Perak, Negeri Sembilan, kemudian balik semula Perlis, Terengganu, Kedah. Rotation sebanyak 9 negeri yang beraja. Okey. Negeri-negeri yang ada Malaysia ada 14. Adapun yang berada itu adalah 9. Yang tak beraja ada yang dikontrol. Okey, 9 rajanya Perlis, Kedah, Kelantan, Terengganu, Perak, Selangor, Pahang, Sembilan juga Johor. Okey, kalau boleh tengok dari sudut susun atur raja berpelambangan dipanggil ketua negara, bapa atau bapa negara lain, bapa ketua negara. Kemudian yang kedua adalah menteri yang paling kerajaan. Okay, ketua kerajaan adalah Perdana Menteri ini yang melalui election di parti mana masuk pada parti. Kemudian ketiganya adalah yang diberi iaitu ketua negeri dan ketua-ketua negeri yang yang negeri juga menteri besar. Kalau tidak ada menteri besar, negeri yang tidak menteri besar yang dipertua negeri itu yang paling ketua kerajaan bagi setiap negeri. Okay. Beda dengan Indonesia ya. Istilah-istilah tu beda. Mungkin Dr. Maisarah tu sebab di Malaysia agak lama ya. Okey, apa kepentingan perlembagaan ini? Okey, pentingnya kan ketua negara dia tak sama macam ketua kerajaan. Banyak keputusan yang dibuat oleh ketua kerajaan. Adapun kita tak nafikan peranan di mana kedai agung. Kepentingan raja berperlembagaan ini, sistem raja berperlembagaan merupakan tonggak keagungan kerajaan Malaysia sejak merdeka sehinggalah sekarang. Kan? Okay, merupakan ketua utama negara. Sistem ini membantu memantapkan kewibawaan institusi beraja di negara Malaysia. Raja berperlembagaan ini merupakan simbol keutuhan dan juga perpaduan rakyat di samping memberikan keimbangan kepada raja menaungi rakyat dan rakyat yang dinaungi oleh raja. Antara yang raja juga bertanggungjawab menjaga dan memelihara kedudukan dan hak istimewa orang Melayu. Pengetahuan di Malaysia Melayu sekitar 60%. 60% Melayu. Okey, Tuan Agong merupakan ketua agama bagi negeri bagi dia merupakan agama negeri dan juga negeri-negeri yang tidak beraja. Pulau Pinang, Melaka, Persekutuan, Kuala. Okey. Terus sedikit tentang raja berperlembagaan. Kebaikan sistem raja ini. Okey, hanya terpilih raja yang boleh dipilih. Menurut darah keturunan nasab, tetapi di dalamnya tersebut dan juga tersisip peraturan yang bercorak demokrasi moden. Okey, maksudnya bila anaknya itu daripada lelaki, barulah anaknya yang pertama. Okey, kemudian yang di-Pertuan Agong ni tapi segala sepanjang kepikirannya. Dah namanya ketua katnya, kuasa mestilah mengatasi yang raja-raja bagi negeri yang lain. Dan yang ketiganya adalah pemilihan cara datang dari kalangan menentukan membawa negeri-negeri Melayu jika dibandingkan sistem Raja England. Kita tahu di mana sistem hanya ada keluarga sahaja. Tidak ada rotation negeri-negeri lain, tak ada. Hanya satu keturunan. Itulah apa sebab sedikit tentang raja berperlembagaan. Jelas ya, betul? Betul? Jelas? Okey. Tak ada putus-putus lagi. Daripada awal kita nampak. Oh, baru tutup. Itulah. Saya pun dengar daripada sana pun tak clear. Minta maaf banyak-banyak. Memang pagi ni masalah connection kan. Memang daripada sana pun tak dengar kan. Tak lambat kali baru sampai suara. Lepas tu terputus-putus kan. Okey, demokrasi berparlimen Okey, sistem pentadbiran kerajaan moden yang mengutamakan mandat dari suara rakyat dalam pemerintahan. Okey, berparlimen maksudnya menggunakan kuasa rakyat untuk memerintah melalui undian. Okey, mandat daripada rakyat ini diterjemahkan dalam pentadbiran melalui dua elemen penting. Yang pertama, yang raya yang berperanan menentukan siapa dimandat untuk membentuk kerajaan. Kemudian parlimen sebagai bahan penting dalam pelaksanaan dan juga perjalanan proses demokrasi di Malaysia. Ciri-ciri demokrasi di Malaysia Yang pertama, perlembagaan yang mana itu adalah undang-undang. iaitu 2/3 kan, masuk dalam parlimen, bincang-bincang dan memerlukan 2/3 persetujuan daripada ahli wakil rakyat kan. Dan memerlukan kepada dua dewan lah, dewan rakyat dan juga dewan negara. Okay. Kemudian elemen yang kedua adalah demokrasi raja pagan yang telah kita bincangkan tadi. Kemudian kuasa pemerintah, dan ada 3 undangan pelaksanaan dan juga kehakiman. Adapun pilihan raya, dan yang keempatnya adalah pilihan raya. Pilihan raya ini maksudnya pengundian lah untuk memilih wakil bagi wakil rakyat, YB yang terhormat. Kemudian dia ada 2 sistem ni, sekali raya umum bagi berikut zon, kawasan dan juga mengikut parlimen. Parlimen itulah yang bakal masuk ke dalam perbincangan dewan parlimen. Rakyat itu hanya bersidang di dalam negeri saja. Parti politik yang mewakili yang mana yang mereka parti politik. Kemudian parlimen dan juga kebebasan asas. Secara umumnya dianggotai oleh 222 ahli dan mewakili 222 kawasan parlimen. Setiap ahli mewakili satu kawasan pilihan raya. Ahli-ahli dipilih atas dasar sokongan ramai melalui pilihan raya yang diadakan setiap 5 tahun. Parti yang memperoleh kursi majoriti Perdana Menteri Malaysia dipilih berdasarkan parti yang dimenangi apakah menjadi pilihan. Kemudian kebiasaannya Perdana Menteri itu adalah mungkin presiden pada parti. Dia tidak ada 2 pemilihan. Kita hanya pilih parti. Kemudian parti yang independen untuk diangkat sebagai Perdana Menteri. Okey, dan kadar bilangan kursi muka parti dan juga negeri parlimen yang ke-14.
Ustazah, you still have 3 minutes left. You still have 3 minutes left.
How many?
3 minutes left. Would you like to?
Okay.
Yeah. Would you like to? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Cuma nak bagi gambaran kalau untuk tahun kalau siapa yang tahu di akhir bulan Mac hari itu berlaku putaran kerajaan di Malaysia. Betul sekali siapa ikuti perkembangan lah kan. Waktu itu berlaku krisis politik di Malaysia dan di mana waktu krisis ini berlaku kita lihat macam mana rakyat berperanan. Itu memang ada pilih pakatan kan. Beberapa parti dibuat gabungan maka jadi satu pakatan yang memerintah Malaysia pada sebelum ni meletakkan jawatan, kemudian nama parlimen yang lain dalam keadaan tidak ada siapa yang boleh dipilih menjadi Perdana Menteri. Kemudian waktu tu Agong yang main peranan dan macam mana baginda dengan pembincangan kepada raja dan pembincangan itu semua, maka baginda telah melantik menteri lah dan share terkini. Okay, I think itu je untuk hari ini. Ya, hari ini ada apa? InsyaAllah kalau ada persoalannya boleh last dan saya minta maaf atas connection yang very real this morning. Saya pun tak mampu nak ikuti tak boleh ikuti conference-nya secara jelas communication tak mampu. Okay, terima kasih. Saya serahkan kepada Harry. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much. And yes, unfortunately, the sound a little bit unclear, but sometimes we have to stop the video, and sometimes the sound becomes clearer because we stop the video. In case there are some questions coming, yeah, if the sound is not clear, the speakers might want to stop the video. All right, now let's move on to the next speaker. The next speaker is Professor Muzayin Ahyar. He got his BA in Islamic philosophy at the State Islamic Institute of Surakarta, and he got his MA in Islamic Studies at the Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University. He has several published works, which I cannot mention one by one, but two of them, which is Aksi Bela Islam, Islamic Collectivism, the New Authority of Religious Propaganda in the Millennial Age in Indonesia, which is published in 2019. And then the next one is Islamic Collectivism, Internet Democracy and Contemporary Islamic Activism in Surakarta, which was published in Studia Islamica Journal in 2017. And seems like through these two works, he tries to develop a kind of conception, which is a collectivism, which will be interesting to discuss in the webinar too. And now his topic is the Indonesian state ideology and the surrounding ideological discourse. In this presentation, he tries to answer the question of how is the Pancasila as a state ideology being discussed and debated in the public sphere, particularly in the social media. So he's been I think he's been doing this in a very long time, observing how the youth, how politicians, how people discuss the Indonesian state ideology, which is Pancasila, in the social media, is the public sphere, and why has it being debated all the time? What are the outcomes, etc., etc. So, without further ado, let's invite Professor Muzayin Ahyar to spit out all of his idea about the Pancasila as a state ideology. You have 20 minutes from now.
Okay, it's not sound clear. My voice clear, Pak Hari?
Yes, thank you. It's clear. Could you please, are you able to share your screen?
It doesn't work. Would you please make me a host to share my presentation today?
Okay, please wait 1 minute.
Okay. While waiting, there are nice presentation from two presenters before, Imad Balkis and also Ustazah Nek Azia. Really nice presentation. First thing first, I want to clarify what has recognized by Pak Hari Widiantoro that I'm not professor at all. Pak Hari, you always make trouble. Yeah, No, it just a joke. Okay, I should. Let's see. Is this work? Yeah. Okay, do you see my presentation, Bu Mai, Pak Hari?
I haven't seen any.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any.
Oh.
Ibu Mai, have you?
New.
Could you? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
perfect.
Start.
Okay. Thank you, Pak Hari. But before going to deliver my presentation, I should say something. I have prepared my presentation in English, but please let me deliver this presentation sometimes in English. Bagaimana anak-anak milenial, khususnya ya pemakai sosial media kan rata-rata milenial ya. Most of them are PIP is one of the authoritative agency to promote the Pancasila in Indonesia, RUU, and so forth and so forth. IBHRS penjaga Pancasila. The state ideological interpretation has allowed resonance in a free public sphere in Indonesia. So I would answer this question by showing the three main reasons here. Historically, politically, and technologically. From historical context, communist idea. Why this happened in Indonesia? Historically, in historical context, there are Indonesia had three living ideologies before the independence of Indonesia. And these ideologies create people behavior which is affect to social, political, cultural, economic, and so on of the state affairs. You can know more detail about the battle of ideologies, of three ideologies here, from the Risalah BPUPKI, what we say, Pak Hari, Risalah BPUPKI in English, the treatise of investigation agency of Indonesian independence preparation. Uh, in Arabic maybe Hayat Tahqiq fi Tahdiriyah li Istiqlal Indonesia. Yasurni jiddan law tafham ma'qul brother Imad.
Shukran jazilan.
Yeah, BPUPKI is agency of Indonesian independence preparation. So in the treatise we can see the free battle ideology in the conference. So the conference of BPUPKI to determine the foundation of the state ideology. In that conference, there were three battling prominent figures who brought their ideology. So the living ideology before Indonesia independence still we can still feel it in our political circumstances in Indonesia. So that's from historical context, and from political context, Islamists and pluralists are two identities that would become a political commodity to gain political voice from a wider community. Islamists always bring a populist discourse of Islam and the state normatively from the old perspective of Islamic history. Islamists are really confident. They are really confident that Islamic norms can control and manage the state politically, while pluralists argue that multiculturalism must be prioritized in managing the state. Pluralists are not entirely comfortable. They are not entirely comfortable with Islamist narrative that they argue that Islam is the only norm to make the state better. This is the reason. So, according to technological context, we know people has been swept by a polarized stream because they continuously, access the online social media. We know that social media works with a mode of algorithm. Ada sosial media karena mereka bekerja dengan cara algoritma, jadi mereka selalu terseret dengan isu-isu yang ada yang bertebaran di media sosial. As we know that algorithm create people which is polarized by several truth claims. When people click one informational subject on the internet, the system of algorithm works to put someone into one polar. The more someone access information, the more someone will be influenced by the information. That is the reason why people today in Indonesia always interpret the state ideology in Indonesia by three ideologies that had lived before Indonesia Independence Day. Well, thank you. I think here my presentation, and I give the time back to Pak Hari. Thank you. Your microphone is still unmute.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Professor Muzain Ahyar. Just for your information that in North America, we call every lecturer as professor. So this regardless of their academic status. So we call you professor. So thank you very much for your insightful presentation, which is very interesting. You try to see how and what are the theoretical background. You try to trace how people talk about Pancasila in the social media, especially the youth, and how it is related to the three ideologies, the three living ideologies, and of course, these three living ideologies has been always contested, and socialism and communism, I think, has been also collapsed in Indonesia, and it was Black history of Indonesia. Anyway, now I'd like to invite some questions from the audiences. Ibu Maisara probably would like to help me with some questions from the audiences. If not, I would like to probably a little bit connect Imat's presentation about Islam and modernity, and also Ahyar presentation about Pancasila as Indonesian state's ideology. So it's very interesting to have Imat here as a, you have a Middle Eastern background. You were born in the refugee camp in Lebanon, and you've seen many things happen in the Middle East, and I think this is also part of how Muslims react to modernity. And what happened in Indonesia is also very interesting. Pancasila is actually a representation of how Muslim society react to the concept of nation state. It's how they react to colonialism. So it's very interesting. So Indonesia is a very diverse community. So we have 99 more presence of Muslims in Indonesia, but when you go to the eastern part of Indonesia, you will see Muslims becomes minority over there. But of course, tension between religious communities always rise. It happens, but people somehow always go back to this Pancasila as something that unite them, which is always contested. So I don't know, probably maybe I would like to I would like Imat, if you want to explore more about regarding Salvatore, about tradition. The tradition, the tradition should also engage with modernity in the public sphere. It is Salvatore's criticism towards the liberal modern liberal modern public sphere. So how do you see the traditions playing in the Middle East, engaging with modernity? If you would like to explore about that.
Yeah. I mean, in relation to what I discussed about Salvatore, he doesn't believe. I mean, you have one group of scholars who think that the colonial intrusion into the Middle East, into the Islamic systems, was really devastating. That colonialism came, installed secular states on the European model, and dismantled Sharia system, and they see as the end of the show, catastrophic. Many scholars see it this way. Even as we saw Professor Halak from McGill and Columbia. Now, on the other hand, there are others, of course. These three categories are found everywhere, and probably in Indonesia. You have those who are completely on one side of the tradition. In this case, it's Islam, and nothing else will work but Islam. Then you have another extreme, which is sort of total adoption of a Western worldview, and they view religion and Islam in this particular case as something outdated. It's not compatible, so they want to go completely the other way. And then you have traditionally the third reformist, what we call them, the reformist group, which wants to stand on the platform of the tradition, but wants to choose and pick from, harmonize sort of as a methodology. What Salvatore says is, you know, you can import concepts from from a European context, but it's not just import them and use them as they is, but you have to develop instruments in the general direction is developing your own ideology, your own ideas, your own culture to produce something that eventually works as instruments in another culture, transculture, like the idea of a civil society, the idea of a public sphere. I mean, they're not going to work in an Islamic context exactly the same way as they work in an European context, but you develop something indigenous to your culture that moves you in the same direction. And one of the examples I mentioned is the idea of a civil society. The idea of a civil society was very effective in Europe, especially in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The idea of civil society worked very effectively in the movements that went across European communities in Eastern Europe and ended up toppling the communist regimes, etc., etc. So this played a very effective role. Now, it didn't catch up in the same way in Egypt or in Syria, or it didn't. But what thinkers like, for example, Shahrur, I know Shahrur is very controversial, and he has, for 40 years, he has produced many things. Some things people agree with, some people reject completely, but he's a wide spectrum. But in this particular case, I'm talking about his idea that the Islamic notion of al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa-nahy anil munkar, which traditionally in our mind is usually associated with the religious authorities, with the religious establishment, with the state, with the center of authority that practices al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. And now he comes and says, no, this is the job for the civil society. The civil society is the one that enforces al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. The press, the media, the political opposition, these are the people who will stand up to the government, to the administrations, and their propensity for corruption. They will stop for them. Because al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar to him is not just limited to issues of halal and haram, as it is traditionally. He takes it in a completely different direction, as al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar is, he takes literally the word ma'ruf in Arabic and the word munkar, which means known, normative, familiar. That is ma'ruf. And al-munkar is something that's not, not normative, strange, frowned upon. That's munkar. And these things change from one society to another. That's what he says, even Islamic societies. In one Islamic societies, what people accept as norm, in another Islamic society might not be that acceptable. And again, we're not talking about doctrinal, about halal and haram. We're talking about more social norms that vary from one society to another. So he sees this as the platform for something like the civil society that adopts this. So it takes it from the establishment and puts it in the hand of the society. They practice this. So this is an example of what I see as a synthesis of what something that that Salvatore suggested, and I think Shahrur, without talking to, I don't think Shahrur and Salvatore ever talk to each other, but it's an example of how an idea is adapted in another cultural context. That's I think the one way of moving somehow in this dilemma. in the variety of options that we have.
Well,
So yeah,
thank
I
you.
don't know.
Yeah,
I hope we have
yeah.
given you.
Thank you very much for the idea of civil society that you said in the Russia. Civil society works very well, but also probably Muzain Ayar also have some interest on the civil movement, civil society movement in the Indonesia. But we'll come back to it later on.
I actually
Uh,
have
Imat,
I'm very interested in the pattern that Muzayan presented. If you can go back to the presentation, you had two patterns.
okay, yeah, we'll come back. We'll come back to it later. We have to see some questions
Okay.
coming in the chat.
Okay.
First, it's from Ramadhani. Is for Imat. So the question is, what do you think about Muslims millennial society in this era? Are they influenced by the modernity, and then do they live their traditions? Probably this is a kind of general question. Probably you would also start by defining what the tradition is. That's what Salvatore is doing, right? Is doing a redefining the tradition. Probably we have to make what the traditions means. We have to make clear what the tradition is first.
Yeah. Well, this is, I mean, there are some scholars who warn between, like when you have these divisions between those who want to stick to tradition and those who want to mix and choose between, let's say, a European tradition. What happens here is those who stand on tradition, both groups actually, what happens is they conflate tradition and religion. For them, religion and Islam becomes the same. Tradition and Islam becomes the same. But at some level, there is, in spite of the different directions that they pull into, they both seem to agree at the core of the tradition being the religion. I mean, they both somehow, that's what I wanted to, that's why I draw my attention to the pattern that was presented by Muzayin. I just wanted to see if I'm reading it correctly, like those two patterns. One is, I think, posing Islam as the core of Pancasila, and the other is posing modernity or something, or nationality as the core of Pancasila. So I was interested in how, what separates them, in finding more what really connects them, at a sub level. So that's what happens usually in these gross divisions. I don't know if this is going in the direction you asked for, Harry, but
yeah, the question is
still a generic idea.
Yeah, so the question is whether the youth now, Muslim youth, of course, leave their tradition because they're influenced by modernity.
Of course, yeah. I mean, modernity is not something you often have a choice. It's not something you import. This is the traditional idea was that this confrontation between tradition and modernity was under the assumption that modernity is something like a ready product that was developed in the West, and because there's an assumption of decay and weakness of structure in the Muslim era, so this import found a good market, so to speak, and it was ready. But nowadays, it's more the view, many scholars are seeing this in a much more complex way. It's not that simple. Some scholars argue that modernity is not a ready product that was developed in the West and just smuggled or pushed into the Muslim world. It's something that developed in this interaction, in this colonial encounter. Parts of modernity are produced there, you know, in this area, in this contact zone, if you want. So modernity is not something that produced in one field and imported into the other. So there's more complex genealogy developing, and this is part of a very interesting area of my research that I'm working on at the moment. You know, just looking at modernity from tracing its genealogies, tracing its different conceptualizations, and you know, it is very interesting.
Well, thank you.
But it's an evolving field.
Oh, thank you very much, Imad. Seems like, if I correctly understand, there is a clear binary from your answer. There is a clear binary between tradition and modernity. So the youth now live their traditions and, you know, leading towards modernity. But probably Muzayan could talk more about how, I don't know, Islamic civil movement like Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama can engage in Indonesian democracy. But probably, yeah, Muzayan can address that issue while also answering Yanti's question. Yanti's question is, what do you think of people who post about Pancasila in the social media? Do you think it is normal, or will it lead to other people? Will it lead to multi-interpretation of Pancasila itself? So Muzain Ahyar, I'll give you a chance to answer that, and if you also like to talk about, you know, how Islamic civil movement in Indonesia engage with democracy is, you know, as the element of modernity.
Thank you, Pak Hari. I can read the question from Miss Yanti. Can you read again by Bahasa Indonesia, Pak Hari?
Okay. Since this is my native language, okay, I'll read it for you. Bagaimana tanggapan Bapak terkait orang berbicara Pancasila di media sosial? Apakah itu lazim atau apakah itu nanti bisa menimbulkan penafsiran yang beragam terkait hal tersebut? Dan apa kira-kira motivasi orang berbicara Pancasila? Terima kasih sebelum Bapak Muzain Ahyar.
Okay, I would like to explain this answer from Miss Yanti first by Bahasa Indonesia. Unfortunately, by Bahasa Indonesia. Jadi di era sosial media, semua orang bebas untuk berbicara, semua orang bebas untuk mengungkapkan pendapat, dan ya hal ini wajar kemudian apabila terjadi perdebatan dan polarisasi di antara para masyarakat terkait Pancasila. Kenapa ya? Pertama karena teknologi dan karena kondisi demokratisasi di Indonesia yang membebaskan setiap orang. Everyone can express themselves in free public sphere in Indonesia. Di sini bebas sejak tahun 1998, sehingga itu membuat semua orang bisa tampil berbicara masalah Pancasila. Yang kedua, yang menjadi persoalan juga kenapa kok terjadi polarisasi ini, karena memang tidak ada lembaga khusus di Indonesia, lembaga otoritatif yang menyatakan apakah kita sesuai dengan Pancasila atau tidak. Kalau lembaga yang mengatakan kita sesuai dengan hukum, sesuai dengan undang-undang atau tidak sudah ada, kan? Ada di tingkat MA, kemudian untuk menyatakan undang-undang keluar dari konstitusi ada MK. Tetapi untuk mengatakan bahwa apakah kegiatan saya ini melanggar sila-sila yang ada Pancasila, belum ada yang memutuskan. Tidak ada state organ, tidak ada lembaga otoritatif yang mengatakan kita sesuai Pancasila atau tidak, apakah kita melanggar Pancasila atau tidak. Oleh karena itu setiap orang sekarang terus terjadi polarisasi itu, selain yang 3 alasan yang disebutkan di presentasi tadi ya. Oke, itu saya kira. Mohon maaf kalau belum terjawab secara keseluruhan. Selanjutnya, I would explore about how Indonesian Muslim civil society in Indonesia at large. Indonesian civil society is become two stream in here. There are mainstream and minority stream. Mainstream is like, you know, NU, Nahdlatul Ulama, and Muhammadiyah. They all these two organization, Islamic mass organization, born before Indonesia itself. So because this So because two organization, mass Islamic organization, born before Indonesia, so they have to ibaratnya mereka harus menyesuaikan Indonesia, pasti menyesuaikan dengan NU dan Muhammadiyah. That's why our country, Indonesia, is never been trapped in democratic threat like other Muslim country in the world. We say Tunisia, Egypt, Turkey, and many Muslim countries, after the democratization process in their country, they are trapped in very serious social conflict. But Indonesia has never been trapped in that serious conflict, but a little bit conflict is, it's not a big deal. It can be rejected maybe 1 or 2 years. We have never been trapped in serious conflict after the democratization process in Indonesia. Why? Because we have mainstream Islamic mass civil society like NU and Muhammadiyah, and we have Pancasila as the political compromise, sebagai kompromi politik between 3 ideologies there. And also the third reason why we have never been trapped is because our military troops, they cordially will back to their barak. So we have never happened with the co-update in Indonesia after the democratization. We see in Egypt the battle between Mursi and satunya siapa Pak Hari? Mursi dan I'm sorry, I forgot about this.
Sisi.
No, the president of Egypt,
Mubarak Sisi.
Sisi, Fatah al-Sisi. They try to update the regime of before, but in Indonesia the military troops will never taken the powers of legitimate power in Indonesia, because they still time to back to their barak. I think that is the condition of civil Muslim organization in Indonesia. There are 2 streams: the mainstream of civil society, which they concern with modernity, plurality, and the other values of democratic norms, and also the most traditional, or what we say, someone in Indonesia say this organization as radical organization, that they wouldn't create meaning of modernity with his religion, with his interpretation of religious context. Yeah, like this. Thank you.
I find it very interesting, Muzayin, what you are saying is that you're relating in comparing the sort of stability in your region in Indonesia as compared to instability in the Middle East, let's say in Turkey or in Egypt or in Iran. You're saying that this is related to the special outlook of the Islamist or of the Muslim grouping in Indonesia. You're relating it to their worldview, so to speak, which is rooted in Islam, but it's more on a moderate side, which makes a lot of sense. But also, I think what's happening in places like Egypt and Syria and Libya, why is it more turbulent, it's also hard to relate it only to their, let's say, confused conception of Islam, let's say. This Islamic movement, it's not because of the confused conception or warped conception of Islam as the main reason why this is happening in there. You know, what I'm saying is that we tend to, especially in the Arab world, they tend to isolate the socio-economic and the political reasons of what's happening. You know what, Egypt and Syria and Lebanon we have always to remember that they are bordering countries with Israel. The presence of a state of Israel in the heart of the Arab world is not something that could be easily excluded from any political or cultural analysis. You know, everything somehow leads back to that conflict. So that's why even in the Arab world, if you look at Tunis is a bit far away from the center, from the Arab center, away from Palestine. So unfortunately, it's the only place where the Arab Spring succeeded. You know, in Tunis, they succeeded, they managed, they have already twice or three times changed regime through the ballot box, which is really a major institution. But that didn't work in Egypt. You know what happened in Egypt. And it will not happen, in Syria or in Lebanon, because there's more. This is my point. When Macron, for example, the French president, said a few weeks ago that Islam has a crisis all over the world, I mean, what he is thinking of, we as Muslims also, we say, have a crisis and we're looking for solution, but these are completely two different views. What he has in mind is not what we have in mind. And what he has in mind, if I want to reply to him, I would say, yes, Islam has a crisis. At least in the Middle East, it's called too much Western intervention. There is, almost every Arab leader in the Middle East cannot rule unless approved by the current system in the Middle East, system that was established in 1916. It's called Sykes-Picot. I don't know if you've heard of it, but Sykes-Picot were the foreign ministers of Britain and France, and they sat together on one table, put a map there, and drew the borders of what will become the Arab world. This is Egypt, this is Syria, this is Libya. They drew it, and this system is still in force. It's still today. They assign, any leader in the Arab world that has to be approved by them. Look what happened in Egypt. There was a genuine revolution that changed the regime. It took only 1 year to relapse back and bring back the same regime, because there is more international pressure on that area, unfortunately, which I think is not found in places like Tunis, or maybe I'm ignorant, but I don't think it's the same level of pressure in Indonesia or in Malaysia. So you have more breathing space, but the Arab world is in the middle of a more violent confrontation, which is with the West. But this is more on the violent side, not the cultural confrontation that we were discussing here. More of a real economic and military confrontation in the case of Israel. So that
Okay, Imad.
complicates things.
Okay. I think this is
Thank you for giving me the other explanation about the Muslim world crisis in over the world. But yeah, I think the explanation must be elaborately explanation from other multicultural perspective. But as what I'm looking at Indonesian context, the initial problem of conflict is indeed in economic, political, and economic is the main problem. But the trigger is still in religion, or it's still in the religious interpretation. I think in Indonesia, I don't know if I'm not mistaken, in other country also the same pattern. The last trigger to blow up the bomb is religious interpretation of economy. I don't know. Yes.
Yeah, that's where I think more research is needed. Yeah. How much is it really attributed to religion? How much is it attributed to something else? I'm not saying religion is not responsible. I'm not saying religion is not implicated in this. And there's a big problem in our understanding of our traditions, of etc., etc. But just a matter of a deep analysis needs to say, okay, this is the percentage of why religion is responsible. This is the percentage why politics, intervention from outside is responsible. This is economic. You know what I mean? We tend just in the discourse today that we see in the media, especially in European media, especially for us living in the West, it's always blaming Islam, always blaming it on some Islamic movement. You know, when a terrorist goes into a church and kills people, in the first hour they decide that this is an Islamic terrorism. Although the guy himself drinks alcohol, takes drugs, and that was reported in the media, and yet they call him Islamic. So what the criteria is missing here. So that what I'm saying is the more analysis needed. Yes, religion in some cases is responsible, but how much? Is it really the major driver, or is it something that's just big enough to use it as a total cover, you know?
Okay, thank you. The next time we can join the research. Elaborate research on this issue, maybe to elaborate more deeply.
Okay, context. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It is a very lively discussion, but unfortunately we have to go to other questions from Ustad Abdul Shakur. Ustad Abdul Shakur wants to talk directly to Imad and also Ustazah Azia. Yes. Ustad Shakur, please, you're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Hari Widiantoro, PhD, Amin. The first, I want to ask to Mr. Ahmad, but I can't speak English well. Because of that, I want to ask with Arabic language, inshallah.
Inshallah, your Arabic is, mashallah, fantastic.
Alhamdulillah. أولا يا شيخ
نعم.
أكثر علماء المسلمين يعارضون ويخالفون القواعد والحدود التي ألفها الشيخ محمد شحرور،
نعم.
خصوصا في قاعدة ملك اليمين.
نعم.
وسؤالنا ما موقفك حول هذه المسألة، حول قاعدة ملك اليمين للشيخ محمد شحرور. والثاني نعم تفضل شيخ.
هل تريد أن أجيب بالعربي أو بالإنجليزي؟
تحت أمرك يا شيخ.
Allah يخليك. I'll answer English so that the other participant can understand.
Yes, yes.
Your question is very simple, Sheikh Abdul Shakur. My opinion of what Shahrur thinks of Mulk al-Yamin. I really cannot claim to have an opinion. You know, Shahrur has been working for 40 years, and he covered the whole spectrum of Islamic issues. Everything he spoke about, and his audience is not all the same. I mean, there are people who are, you know, anything Shahrur says is for them non-negotiable. They accept it. And there are people who cannot stand Shahrur and they reject everything they say. And there are people in the middle. For me, particularly, personally, I cannot even claim that I'm familiar with all his ideas. But for me, for the purpose of my research, I was focusing on one issue. I'm not even aware of all of the things he said on Mulk al-Yamin. But as you know, Mulk al-Yamin, you know, 1400 years later, is still, it's hardly there is one opinion, you know, it is a controversial. And even today, Shahrur said, after whatever he said, you'll find others who say completely different issues. Still, nobody can claim to understand fully what this issue is. That's one of the things that makes Shahrur controversial. But for my research, I was focusing just on the issue of his first issue, actually, is the distinction between Al-Kitab and Al-Quran. For me, there's a lot of sense in what he says there, because we are used to think the tradition uses taraduf. You know, taraduf is very common in tafsir and fiqh. And this, Shahrur says, look, we have to be careful with taraduf. You cannot say Al-Quran, Al-Kitab, Al-Furqan, Al-Dhikr. All four concepts mean the same thing. In traditional tafsir, it's all mean the same thing. Doesn't make any difference. But he uses this. He gives example of how useful this is in making us understand the Tanzil in a much better way. For example, you know, he distinguishes between Kitab and Quran, leads him to a distinction between the role of the Prophet and the role al-Nabi or Rasul. And this is, for me, the attraction in Shahrur methodology. He says traditional scholarship did not make much importance of this distinction between the role of a Nabi and the role of a Rasul in the Quran, because I mean, you can find tens of verses in the Quran, ayat, which says ما على الرسول إلا البلاغ لست عليهم بمسيطر ولو شاء الله لجعل الناس أمة واحدة فهل أنت تكره الناس حتى يكونوا مؤمنين. All this address to the Rasul emphasizes that your job is just to give the message. ليس عليك من حسابهم في شيء, etc., etc., etc. Very clear message. And this is all addressed to Rasul. And then you find verses where he say, يا أيها النبي. Now the address changes. يا أيها النبي جاهد الكفار والمنافقين وأغلظ عليهم. يا أيها النبي حرض المؤمنين على القتال. This is a completely different address. In one task, he's telling him, you know, your job is just to give the message. You're not responsible for following up. They believe you or don't believe you. إنما عليك البلاغ وعلينا الحساب. And the other messages, they say, no, you know, get them ready for the fight. It's a completely different. And Shahrur picks up on this and says, okay, you see, this address is for a Rasul, this address for a Nabi. So we must understand the difference. A Rasul is, you know, so from this behavior, he goes into saying there are things that the Prophet, that Muhammad والسلام, did as a Prophet, and there are things that he did as a Rasul. So the things that he did as a Rasul are obliging to Muslims to follow and stick to universally in his time and after his passing. For the end of time, what the Rasul did is continues in time and space. But we have to look carefully at the things that he did as a Nabi, because this is more temporal. More, he was the Prophet was Rasul receiving this message, receiving al-Wahi, and now he interprets it in his life. He tries to change it into behavior, he puts it into action. But here he's using his own discretion. I mean, the Quran, the Wahi is not coming to him with a complete catalog, you know, like, okay, this is what you do in this case, this is what you do in this case. He really is struggling in implementing this, in translating it into a human action. And this, I think personally, this is a part of the beauty of the personality of the Prophet that usually is missing from our culture. You know, we exaggerate the role of the Prophet, we make him like a Superman, but really there is so much beauty in watching him as a human being suffering and trying to do the right thing. And don't forget, in the book, the Quran many times comes hard on the Prophet, comes hard on him, say, why did you do this, that? Samahak Allah, you shouldn't have done that. It's very hard. So you put yourself in the place of this man, and that gives you a completely different view, which is usually absent from our culture. We don't look at the Prophet like this, like the human who suffers, who tries his best to translate the Wahi into daily life. So this part is the part of the Nabi, which Shahrur argues is not binding to future generation of Islam. How the Prophet dressed, how he ate, how he solved local problems is to stay in that time. And he goes back always to the Quran. So the Prophet, whatever he did, was interpreting in his own discretion the Quran, which remains the final reference. So that's I mean, still controversial, but that's, for me, that is the zoom on Shahrur. That's really my interest in Shahrur, is this. All the other issues will need time and research, and I cannot claim I have gone into them, really.
Thank you very much, Imad.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ustad Abdul Shakur.
I hope I answered you, Abdul Shakur.
Yes, I understand, Sheikh. Thank you very much, Sheikh.
Allah yakhalik.
Ustad Abdul Shakur also wants to ask Ustazah Nik Azia.
Yes,
Tafadhal
yes.
mashkur,
Ustaz
Ustaz.
Hari. Syukran, Ustaz Hari. Pertanyaan yang kedua untuk Ustazah Nik Azia. Saya membaca dari beberapa tulisan-tulisan di media-media mainstream ya di Indonesia. Jadi kok kelihatannya agak aneh sistem pemilihan Perdana Menteri yang ada di Malaysia itu. Kasus mulai dari Perdana Menteri Mahathir Muhammad ketika ditagih terus oleh koalisinya Anwar Ibrahim, karena katanya ada perjanjian sebelumnya bahwa setelah sekian tahun maka nanti diserahkan kepada Anwar Ibrahim. Tapi demi untuk tidak menyerahkan itu kepada Anwar Ibrahim, akhirnya Mahathir Muhammad kemudian melepaskan jabatan itu dengan harapan beliau maju lagi untuk menjadi Perdana Menteri. Tetapi parlemen ternyata bergeser ke Muhyiddin Yassin. Nah, sekarang Anwar Ibrahim mengklaim bahwa parlemen ini mendukung saya, sehingga beliau berusaha untuk menemui sang Maharaja agar diangkat menjadi seorang Perdana Menteri. Jadi sebenarnya sistem pengangkatan Perdana Menteri itu seperti apa? Kok kelihatannya mudah sekali? Tidak seperti di Indonesia, ini kan luar biasa sulit. Mungkin kepada Mrs. Nik Azia, kami minta pencerahan supaya ada pemahaman yang utuh tentang masalah ini. Syukran Syahar. Syukran Syahar.
Oke, terima kasih ya. Pada soalan. Nampaknya perkembangan politik Malaysia dengan baik sekali. Okey, ya, memang sekarang mudah sekali untuk pertukaran PM. Kemungkinan akan berlaku pertukaran PM bila-bila masa saja. Karena sekarang parti yang memerintah Malaysia hanya mempunyai mayoritas hanya 2 kerusi sahaja. Dan apa yang kita tahu, krisis yang berlaku di Malaysia adalah kerana berlakunya lompat-lompat, faham ya? Lompat-lompat oleh wakil dipilih oleh rakyat. Inilah yang kita rasa kita sebagai pensyarah di lecturer dekat di universiti harus tanamkan kepada anak didik kita supaya apabila kamu semua keluar ke dalam masyarakat nanti dipilih menjadi pemimpin, perkara yang perlu dititik beratkan adalah amanah dan juga tegas pada pendirian. Ya. Ini karena kita lihat pada pendirian wakil-wakil rakyat itu gayanya macam boleh main lompat-lompat. Yang kita sebagai rakyat yang asyik terkejut aja, itu lompat, ini lompat ya. Maka hari ini kita boleh lihat ya, seperti mana yang saya cerita daripada awal presentation tadi adalah peranan yang dimainkan raja. Macam mana raja berperanan dalam menentukan siapa yang sebenarnya yang layak untuk dipilih sebagai PM awal krisis hari itu. Kerana apa? Masing-masing mendakwa dia ada mayoritas di belakangnya. Anwar Ibrahim mendakwa dia ada mayoritasnya, begitu juga parti pemerintah sekarang. Maka di situ kita lihat macam mana kebijaksanaan Raja Agung memainkan peranannya. Maksudnya dia memanggil ketua-ketua parti, bawa bincang, minta pengakuan dan akhirnya Baginda membuat keputusan berdasarkan keutamaannya pada Melayu dan juga pada agama. Kerana kalau kita lihat parti yang menyokong Anwar Ibrahim itu di belakangnya adalah Chinese. Kebanyakan dia adalah Chinese. Dan sewaktu Pakatan Harapan memerintah sebelum daripada sekarang, parti yang diwakili oleh Mahathir dulu bersama dengan pakatannya itu ramai yang Cina, yang mana kita lihat sedikit demi sedikit Melayu cuba dihapuskan, Islam cuba dihapuskan. Melalui pemerhatian itu saya rasa Agong membuat keputusannya yang sungguh bijaksana, memilih mana yang terbaik di antara kalangan mereka. Wallahu ta'ala alam. Itu saja penjelasannya.
Terima kasih Mrs. Niazia.
Terima kasih Ustazah. There is one more question from the student. I think the questions. I think the questions is for everybody, every speaker. As a Muslim in Indonesia, as a majority Muslim in Indonesia, we have a lot of propaganda that potentially break the unity of the ummah, break the ukhuwah al-Islamiyah or al-ukhuwah al-Wataniyah. So the question is, what should we do as a Muslim society, as a Muslim majority, to how should we behave? How should we respond to that? But this is the question from Muhammad, undergraduate student of State Islamic Institute of Samarinda. Now I will invite anybody, maybe from Imad, Balkis, and then Ustazah, and then Muzain Ahyar, if you would like to respond to it.
I cannot talk directly into the Indonesian context because, embarrassingly, I have to admit that I'm very ignorant of the country. I can draw a comparison to the Palestinian context, for example, which is I'm familiar with, or the Lebanese context. But in Palestine, for example, we also, you have, at some point, the Christian population of Palestine was close to 20%, 20% Muslims, 20% Christians, and under the British occupation in the early 20th century, the Brits tried to make this split, you know, like split the Muslims and the Christians on using the missionaries, but gladly they failed. You know, the Palestinians stuck together. They didn't, you know, they managed to stick together. They foiled these attempts to break them along religious lines. So I don't know what exactly the mechanism, the down to earth, how the sort of activism that was applied to foil these, but it was clear that the British always used this technique of divide and rule. They used it in India, they used it in every community, they used it in Africa, divide and rule, and somehow it didn't work with Palestine in splitting Christians and Muslims. So I think because what binds people, I always say this also in the context of the Arab-Israeli, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. When I also have discussions with many of my colleagues who are Jews, not all of them sympathetic with Israel, but I always make this connection that religion is a very strong bind, but it's not the only bind, you know? So Indonesian Muslims and Indonesian non-Muslims, they still have a lot in common, you know, a lot that binds them. Being divided along religious lines doesn't help either of them. I mean, this might come as simplistic and naive, but honestly, this is the best I can come up from my own experience, you know. I have had discussions with Jews who are Iraqi Jews, you know, I mean, consider them Arab Jews. And you feel a lot of bind with them than, say, in contrast with a British Jew. You know, even the British Jew and the Iraqi Jew, they find much less in common between them than between an Iraqi Jew and the Palestinian Muslim. You know, it's just the bind here is not religion, but there is a lot in culture that binds, apart not just religion. Religion is a very strong bind, but it's not the only one. So if there is a will, if there is a good niyyah to build bridges, you will find a lot to work on in people of the same in the same culture, in the same geography, in the same language. There's so much. It should be difficult to divide people. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's the best I can come up with.
Thank you very much. I'll translate it to Indonesia. So, Imat bilang bahwa religion is a bind. Agama itu adalah satu pengikat, tapi agama saja tidak cukup. Misalnya, Imat bisa berdiskusi dengan Jewish yang ada di Irak, Arab Jewish yang juga punya kultur Arab yang bisa mengikat antara Imat dan Jewish tersebut, tapi Imat tidak bisa berdiskusi dengan Jewish yang dari British misalnya, yang dari Inggris misalnya. Jadi bahwasannya agama saja itu tidak cukup bisa untuk menyatukan kita. Bahkan di antara Jewish saja, Jewish di Palestina, Jewish di Kanada, Jewish di Irak akan tidak bisa berdiskusi dengan Jewish yang ada di Inggris gitu. Dan selain itu ada poin penting yang ditekankan oleh Imat bahwa the impact of colonialization, konsekuensi dari kolonialisme yang terjadi di banyak tempat. Imat menyebutkan di India konflik antara Hindu dan Muslim, lalu di Lebanon antara Kristen dan Muslim, dan di banyak tempat lainnya. In Indonesia, for your information, we also had a pretty uh, a big conflict, but it didn't last long. So after the democratization, after the downfall of Suharto in 1998, we had several conflicts, in ethnical conflicts in Kalimantan, and also interreligious conflict in Maluku between Muslim and Christians. But it didn't last long. So it could be resolved. So yeah, compared to India between Hindus and Muslim, compared to Lebanon, compared to many parts of, the world, we had successfully resolved the conflict.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, uh,
It
so you
it's
want to
always
add more?
Yeah, it always helps when you don't have an external party who has a vested interest in creating this division, which probably you don't have sort of division that happens in Syria and Lebanon. And there are a lot of external parties that are ready to jump in and play both sides against each other, even provide weapons, provide propaganda, there is more at stake in terms of politics in this part of the world in that sense.
Yes, unfortunately, yeah, that's something we might discuss more. Yeah, the external element.
Yes, yeah,
So
much more.
probably Muzayin wants to add more, and also I'll allow Ustazah Azia to also address the question if you would like to address.
First, Pak Hari. Okay, thank you. I do agree with Imad. Every nation has what we say binding material to make the
Hold it together,
difference
yeah.
between one identity and other identity. Yeah, but I think the question has subjective direction here from Muhammad, student of Iain Samarinda. According to historical context, yeah, just keep on the middle path. Just keep on the middle path, not to left, not to right. I mean, Muslim has various interpretation in their Islamic uh, norms. Some people say that Islam is only norms, is only general norms. And some people know Islam is not only general norms, but Islam is the whole system of life, even if political, economic, culture, etc., etc. You can react this phenomena by staying on the middle path. Yeah, sometimes Islam put the system, and sometimes Islam put the normative things uh, in daily life. Yeah, just like that to prevent the propaganda from radicalist extremists or etc. etc. Yeah, that's all, Pak Hari.
Thank you, Aher.
Simple question.
And Ustazah Zia, Ustazah Azia probably wants to address if you would like to address. If not, then do we still have time? If not, then I will invite Ibu Maisyarah or the Master of Ceremony to take over. Would you like to read it for us? And how many minutes do we still have left? Okay. Yes, Professor Muzain Ahyar, go ahead.
So, where is the place of atheist in this? I would like to simplify the question. I think where is the place of atheism in this country? Am I right? Yeah. I think there is no atheist in this world. Nggak ada ya. I'm sorry to speak in that language. To Panggali Husodo, so the question addressed to me. Ya, Panggali Husodo saya kira tidak ada itu ateis dalam sebenar-benarnya ateis di Indonesia, karena setiap orang yang percaya bahwasanya di luar sana terdapat sebuah the great power beyond their self, dia sudah punya ketuhanan sebenarnya. Jadi ateis itu bukan sebuah konsep menolak Tuhan, tetapi menolak konsep ketuhanan. Atheism is not about who rejected the God, but they are rejecting the concept of godness, something like that lah. Jadi Soekarno itu masih memberi tempat, meskipun Pancasila kita di negara, yang penting kewajiban negara kita sebagai warga negara Indonesia kan mendukung NKRI, kemudian taat kepada hukum. Selama mereka melakukan dua itu, ya mereka punya tempat di Indonesia, dan ya mereka bisa hidup di sini tanpa harus mengabaikan apa yang mereka sebut sebagai ideologi negara Pancasila itu ya. Ya saya kira itu ateisme dalam konteks Soekarno. Kalau kita dengar secara eksplisit ya pesan-pesan Soekarno dalam setiap pidatonya tentang Pancasila kan, semua orang yang punya konsep ketuhanan itu bisa hidup di sini. Tetapi kita secara formally, secara legally, secara hukum kita punya hanya 6 konsep agama di sini. Terus yang lain-lain apakah tidak boleh? Ya mereka tentu masih punya konsep ketuhanan mereka sendiri-sendiri. Oleh karena itu harusnya mereka diterima dengan alasan apapun di Indonesia ya. Itu saya kira ateisme. Ya pidato Soekarno mungkin banyak tentang ateisme, tentang ketuhanan ya. Salah satunya kalau mau jadi Islam jangan jadi orang Arab. If you want to become a Muslim, don't become Arabic, just like Soekarno. If you want to become Hindu, don't be India. Ini Soekarno, ya kan? Itu pesan-pesan Soekarno. Kalau mau jadi orang Arab kalau mau jadi orang Islam jangan jadi orang Arab. Kalau mau jadi orang Hindu jangan jadi orang India. Ya, just like what Imad explained, we have material binding here, cultural. Ya, meskipun kita berbeda secara agama, even we contradict our religious norm, but we can still a midpoint in humanity, maybe. Yeah, the midpoint between you and me is humanity. Ada apa ya di Quran, fil Quran hunaka al-ayah kalimatun sawa baini wa bainakum. Yeah, this is the material binding from the differences, human differences in this world. Jadi meskipun ateis masih tetap harus punya binding material. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Ayer was explaining about first the definition of atheism. Atheism doesn't mean rejecting God, but atheism means rejecting the idea, the concept of God. I'm not sure about that, but this is also an issue with the Pancasila actually. So on the one hand, this is a compromise between religious community, but who are they? Who are these religious communities? What about those who are not religious? What about those who are not part of this religious community? For example, indigenous communities. So we have it's interesting to see the first principle of Pancasila, which is belief in God.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I mean, Harry, I mean, remember many people take the example of when the Prophet moved to Medina, he was governing a new community, which wasn't all Muslims. There were Muslims, there were Jews, there were Christians, but there were also what the Quran calls them al-munafiqeen, wal-kadhibin. And he knew who was everybody. He knew there were munafiqeen and he knew kadhibin. He didn't hold them to account. He didn't, So that was the new plurality of Al-Madinah, which some scholars say that the name of the city was Yathrib before the Prophet moved. But when he moved, it became Al-Madinah. Al-Madinah has a very special significance in Arabic, Al-Madinah means particularly this openness, this tolerance, this pluralism, because the Quran talks always about Al-Qura, 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 Ahl Al-Qura, and talks differently about Al-Madinah. And some people point out that if you follow this discourse in the Quran, you find that always Al-Qura is mentioned as a negative connotation, while Al-Madinah is always associated with this openness and tolerance and plurality and variety. Something for more research, but I think there is a point there that that intentionally the name of Yathrib was changed to Al-Madinah when the Prophet found himself in a governing situation over this community, which was very diverse. While Qura are always described in the Quran as monochromic, one idea, totalitarian society, Al-Qura. That's why they're always associated with Ihlak al-Qura. Not because in the traditional scholarship, in the tafsir, they translate Qura as human community, which is neutral. But some scholars say no, it's not just a human community. Qura is a human community with a problem. It's a negative. That's why they always come in the discourse of punishment and halak. And they contrast it always to Al-Madinah in the Quran. There's something to think about. But the point, as Muzayyin did, made, it's open society can produce a better living condition for everyone. And in the end, only God knows who is munafiq and who is pretending to be believer. This is something inside your heart. You cannot and who is and identity in the end is multi-layered, as always. And identity in the end is multi-layered. We're not one thing. None of us is just one thing. You're Muslim and Indonesian. I'm Muslim and Palestinian, and I live in Canada for 23 years. I'm also Canadian. It's multi-layered, and identity is dynamic. In a certain situation, one identity comes to the fore, and others go back, and so on and so on. I believe in this as someone who lived in so many different places.
Okay, thank you very much, Imad. I wasn't taking any position on the position of atheism in Indonesia, but I was going to relate what Ahyar said about atheism in Indonesia. To what you said about tradition, actually. So because yeah, Pancasila is a compromise between among religious traditions. Um, but at the same time, there is a possibility that one tradition can dominate other non-dominant traditions, which is indigenous religion, and there's something we have to also criticize. So the idea of how should the idea of traditions comes to the public. Um, so yeah, I was questioning whether Salvatore is aware of the possibility of one traditions dominate other tradition, which can destroy the pluralism at the same time. Well, anyway, do we still have time? Or if not, then I will give the time back to Bu Maishara.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hari. It was very interesting. So please, we give virtual applause to this session. Yeah, for your information, we have 230 participants live into 2 Zooms. This Zoom 230.
MashaAllah.
Yeah, yeah, Alhamdulillah, and they still, yeah, a good listener. Alhamdulillah, we got many things today to discussion. It is very interesting, I think. So finally, we are in the last session. Let's close our conference by saying Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. So finally, I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Imad.
Thank you.
Yeah, we are very exciting and interesting with your presentations. Many things, yeah, we can change knowledge, share knowledge, Alhamdulillah. And thank you very much, Ustazah Azia. We have many knowledge, yeah, about Raja in Malaysia, and also Mr. Muzayin. He is lecturer in Iain Samarinda, and Mr. Hari, Masya Allah, from Canada. Luar biasa sekali ya, Mr. Hari. Thank you very much, and jazakumullah sanal jaza, syukran jazilan, and I hope we will have next event in this international conference, inshallah, in another team, inshallah. Okay, I'm Maishara. I'm chairman of this committee of this international conference. We are apologize for any mistakes, and thank you very much. Stay healthy and keep positive. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Imad.
Syari.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Hope to see you in the future.
Inshallah, inshallah.
Rambutnya Mr. Hari luar biasa di Kanada.
Yeah, the style Hari.
Yeah, new style.
New style in Canada.
It's amazing, fantastic. Yeah.
Okay, Hari. Okay, Hari.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Thank you, sisters and brothers. Thank you very much. All the best.
Yeah.
Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Zidlip ya Bu Maya.
Oke, makasih ya, Prof.
Provokator.
Beda-beda tipis aja. Provokator tuh.
Iya.
Iya, suka saya provokator. Yang penting beda dari yang lain sudah.
Bagus.
Oke, dadah.
Ya, thank you.
Ya, makasih semuanya ya yang hadir.
Baru gabung lagi nih.
Wah, terlambat.
Oke, Pak.
Terima kasih ya.
Closing, Pak.
Baru gabung lagi. Tadi ngejar Pak Imad nggak sempat tadi itu.
Ya, beliau sudah leave, Pak.
Oke, terima kasih semuanya.
Ya, sama-sama Pak Dekan. Terima kasih.
Hari udah keluar kan Pak Hari?
Kayaknya Pak Hari sudah leave deh. Udah keluar, Pak. Karena di sana udah jam 11 malam. Ya. Karena semangat jadi nggak ngantuk kayaknya.
Sampai rambutnya.
Biasa begadang.
Rambutnya.
Makasih Pak Mayudin ya, Pak Mayudin makasih semuanya.
Ya Pak Mayudin, makasih Pak. Sama-sama. Itu baru memperlihatkan.
Itu yang di
belakang layar.
peserta sudah saya
Layar tapi jadi penentu itu.
serta matikan sudah.
Oke, salut ya. Makasih semuanya.
Ya Pak, makasih banyak Pak.
Betul.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Saya sambil muji nih. Mohon maaf.
Iya Pak, apa-apa Pak.
Betul.
Waalaikumsalam. Habis baterai. Iya. Udah tinggal kita ini ya. Terima kasih Winda Adisa. Terima kasih semuanya. Ini mati.